Welcome back to the podcast. My name's Alex. I'm a consultant psychiatrist. For the next couple of weeks, I'm traveling, and the team and I are taking a couple of weeks off from our usual interviews and essays, but I wanted to introduce you to a quick idea that people could find useful when they're trying to deal with a particular issue, and to make some useful distinctions between coaching and therapy. Nowadays, people may experience a lot of confusion when trying to choose between a therapist or a coach when dealing with a particular problem. And of course, a lot of therapy may involve a little bit of coaching, and a lot of coaching may involve some therapy. But it's quite rare for people to articulate clearly what's the difference between the two. They're kind of used interchangeably on platforms like Instagram and so on. But the truth is, it is at times more appropriate to choose one rather than the other, or to have the mindset of one rather than the other. So we're going to discuss that a little bit today. This idea came to my mind when I was working with a client a couple of years ago who was trying to get into a relationship. And it's funny how you can approach even a concrete problem like this from so many different angles. Often when working with a client, you're trying to figure out what's the best way for them to approach it, or for you to approach it with them. For this client, for example, should they work on the practicalities of getting into a relationship, like going out more, working on social skills, getting on a dating app, making a dating profile? Or should the work focus more on deeper and older problems like childhood attachment, previous trauma, personality work, etc.? I ended up working with the client for about a year, and while we did talk about some of the more practical strategies, ultimately our work focused more on the deeper aspects of their psychology, their relationship with their parents and siblings, their previous romantic relationships and friendships, and even their relationship with themselves, their self-talk, the common thinking and emotional patterns that emerged for them, inappropriate feelings of guilt, self-esteem problems, etc. But that being said, as their therapist, I was concerned that I wasn't doing a good job, because despite the fact that we were doing a lot of so-called inner work, the client had not taken any major steps towards being in a new relationship. Although they were going out a bit more and socializing a bit more, they were opening up somewhat to new ways of socializing and communicating. That new relationship hadn't really happened. We continued to see each other for about a year, until one session my client told me something like, "I think I've reached a point where I can start to take some serious steps towards dating and potentially getting into a relationship." My client proceeded to tell me that therapy had helped them become more aware of and get some relief from the inappropriate feelings of guilt, the shame, the low self-esteem which kept them stagnant and in a state of psychological inertia. They now felt they had some clarity of mind. They had a sense that they knew what they had to do and they were ready to do it. At that point, it occurred to me that a useful way of conceptualizing the dichotomy between inner work and more behavioral practical work is this idea of accelerator versus brake. In other words, if you want to make progress towards dealing with a particular problem in your life, you can press on the accelerator using behavioral techniques, taking a lot of action in the external world, experimenting with different ways of doing things, or you can take your foot off the brake. For example, by processing past trauma, disentangling stifling thinking patterns or emotional patterns, or examining different ways in which you self-sabotage. This concept of accelerator versus brake is useful for a few reasons. It can be applied to basically any life problem, even if you're not in therapy or coaching, whether that's trying to get into a relationship, trying to stop using drugs, trying to get a better job. It can help someone diagnose where they're at with a problem, and it can also help someone plan out their own path and figure out what kind of intervention might be more appropriate at any one time. It can help you identify facets of your self-development which you may be ignoring, and lastly, it can help you understand why a particular intervention may not be working. Like, for instance, let's say someone is slamming on the accelerator while the brakes are still engaged. It can lead to a kind of deep psychological conflict. For example, someone is trying to quit smoking cigarettes using various behavioral techniques, but they haven't processed that for them, smoking is a deep part of their identity, and that needs to be re-examined before behavioral techniques are likely to be of any use. Or indeed, if someone is trying to get into a relationship, like my client, they may not have processed attachment issues or relational traumas, which may actually make being in a relationship quite difficult. Another example is me starting this podcast. When I started it, my mind was focused on acceleration, doing the things, buying the equipment, taking the practical steps that I needed to take in order to launch it and get it off the ground. What I didn't anticipate was that I was going to face all sorts of psychological barriers, my own fears, my own insecurities, etc., which I really had to re-examine and process before I was able to do the external work consistently enough to actually get the thing going. The way I would put it to you is like this. When you're pressing on the accelerator without having thought about the brakes, you're likely messing with old, deep-seated coping mechanisms that exist to protect you. And although they may be dysfunctional, if you mess with them without having carefully considered the function they serve for you and how you could replace them with healthier, more mature coping mechanisms, this can, at the extreme, lead to a kind of personal crisis. Addiction is another good example of this. I saw this a lot when I worked in an addiction clinic, where patients typically try their best to stop drinking or using drugs without stopping to think about the function that the drugs and alcohol have for them. And what that meant was once they were abstinent, they were left in a kind of limbo state, and that put them at a very high risk of relapse. On the other hand, someone may have worked on a lot of the deeper aspects of their problem and may still be wondering why they haven't achieved the result they wish. So a person may have done a lot of work taking their foot off the brakes, but there's no acceleration. A common and persistent myth in therapy and self-development is that if you do the inner work, a lot of life's external problems kind of solve themselves. This is the kind of thinking exemplified by New Age philosophies like The Secret and the Law of Attraction that is all about mindset and vision, and it's this idea that once that is in order, everything else will fall into place. I actually think there's some interesting truth in these philosophies, in that I do think once your mindset is healthier, your perception does change. And if you want more detail about this, check out a previous audio essay I wrote, You Are What You Focus On, which maybe has the most important information we've ever discussed on this podcast. But yes, once your mindset is healthier, your perception does change, but often external problems still need to be worked on directly, and this can still be a challenge. But it is generally much easier to do once the internal obstacles are removed. It's kind of like the difference between hiking up a steep hill and hiking up a steep hill with a 50-pound weight vest. For example, let's say your goal is to find a fulfilling career. You've spent some time in therapy diffusing some unhelpful ideas you've internalized, say from your parents, about what a quote appropriate job is. This can be really helpful, but will not by itself get you the career you want. You will still then need to go about the often dry and tedious work of getting a job, redoing your CV, filling out applications, facing rejection, trying out different forms of work, seeing what kind of work fascinates you, engages you, makes you feel more fulfilled, and then going about the careful process of crafting a career that allows you to do that fulfilling work as much as possible, and then figuring out how to monetize it so you can actually get paid for that work. You can see where I'm going with this. It's a long process, and inner work simply isn't going to get you there by itself. So if you're slamming on the accelerator with the brakes engaged, that can be a problem. But if you just do the work of releasing the brakes without putting your foot on the accelerator, that probably won't get you to your goal. So ultimately, if you want to take any goal seriously, both facets of the work are important to consider, whether you get professional help for them or not. And generally speaking, it's possible to do both kinds of work in parallel. For example, you may go to therapy to work on releasing the brakes, while pressing on the accelerator in your life in between sessions. Or you may work on the brakes with personal practices like journaling or meditation, and then use a coach to press on the accelerator. Generally speaking, therapy does tend to focus more on resolving difficulties and inhibitions, working on the brakes, and moving towards psychological health, while coaching does tend to be more about performance, pressing on the accelerator, and achieving to the best of your ability. In my opinion, a skilled coach or therapist is able to do both to some degree, and importantly knows when to refer someone if they feel out of their depth. For example, a good coach should know how to identify when a client actually has a lot of deeper psychological issues to work on through therapy and refer to a therapist, while a good therapist may realize when they're not ideally suited to optimize someone's performance and refer to a coach if it's appropriate. One caveat that's important to mention, of course, is that this accelerator versus brake concept is just a useful idea. It's not a perfect representation of reality. In reality, the lines between psychological acceleration and braking are a lot more blurry. Doing work in the external world can inform your internal work and vice versa. Moreover, there's no finishing line. No one has completely disentangled their psychological brakes, and no one is in flawless acceleration. Be aware that for many people, working on the brakes can be an excuse for not pressing on the accelerator, while for other people, pressing on the accelerator and chasing an external goal can be an excuse for not working on the brakes, which can often be a very unpleasant, if important, process, frankly. So what I would encourage you to do is think about a personal problem you currently have through the lens of what we've talked about today, and consider A. Are you making good progress towards dealing with this problem? B. Are you mostly dealing with this problem by pressing on the accelerator, changing your behavior, doing external practical work, or by working on your brakes, changing your mindset, processing past experiences, doing inner work? And C. Do you feel in relative psychological harmony around this problem? Do you, like my client, know what you want and how to get it? Or do you feel quite conflicted about this problem psychologically? Do you still feel stuck or stagnant? I hope you found this idea useful. Again, I'm traveling for a couple of weeks, so next week I'm going to share another small idea just like this one. Do tell me what you think about it. You can email us at thinkingmindpodcast@gmail.com. I'd also like to mention that the details I shared about my client today were all actually changed to disguise their identity and protect their confidentiality. This is the Thinking Mind Podcast, a podcast all about psychiatry, psychology, psychotherapy. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you here next time.